Hey Planeswalkers, this is Eric from Bane Alley Magic, bringing you another Magic the Gathering video. Today I'm counting down my top 10 underrated red cards for Commander. These are not what I think are the most powerful red cards. These are just 10 cards I hardly see anyone playing, and I think they deserve more attention. I'm not checking EDH Rec or MTG Top 8 for stats on these cards because I don't think those websites are an accurate portrayal of casual Commander. I mean, hardly anyone I know is posting their decks online at all, and even if they do, it doesn't mean they actually play those decks. So I'm basing this list on my years of casual Commander experience. Again, just because something is number one doesn't mean it's the most powerful. It means it's the most underrated for how powerful. It means it's the most underrated for how powerful it is. So let's get into the honorable mentions, starting with Stolen Strategy, which is 4 and a red for an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of each opponent's library. Until end of turn, you may cast non-land cards from among these exiled cards, and you may spend mana as though it were any color to cast those spells. So this enchantment is pretty much straightforward card advantage in red. Normally red loots. It draws cards and then discards that many cards. Unless you can play cards from your graveyard, looting is more of card replacement than card advantage. Red also has some card advantage with cards like Light Up the Stage, in which you exile cards from your library and you have until the end of the turn to play them. And this can be pretty risky because you may exile something from your library that you can't cast, and so it's just gone forever. But with Stolen Strategy, it's your opponent's cards that are getting exiled, so that downside is nullified completely. So in a 4-player game, Stolen Strategy gets you up to 3 cards every turn, and that is fabulous value for 6 mana. It didn't make the list because it kind of turns the table against you, and I have seen it played a little bit, but overall I think this card is definitely underrated and deserves more play. Next is Pyrohemia, 2 and 2 red for an enchantment that says at the beginning of the end step, if no creatures are on the battlefield, sacrifice Pyrohemia, and you can pay a red, and Pyrohemia deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. So this card is a red version of Pestilence, a pretty popular card in black, and both are great at getting your opponent's creatures under control. This will stop some opponents from casting creatures completely. It becomes even better if there is an indestructible creature on the battlefield, because then you'll probably never have to sacrifice it. On top of killing creatures, this can kill your opponents. It damages you as well, but if you can gain a little bit of life, it won't matter. This is an awesome repeatable board wipe. It didn't make the list because it is played in pretty much every Rakdos Lord of Riot decks, and it probably is a staple in some other decks. Even so, this does not see enough play, and you should be considering it for any red deck. And the last honorable mention is Impending Disaster, another enchantment. 1 and a red, and it says, during your upkeep, if there are 7 or more lands in play, sacrifice Impending Disaster and destroy all lands. I think this card is great because it is only 2 mana, while other red mass land destruction spells are at least 5 to cast. Getting the same deal for just 2 mana is awesome. Of course, as soon as you play this, all of your opponents are going to be freaking out and trying to remove it. Thankfully, there are multiple red cards like Wild Ricochet, which can protect Impending Disaster until it goes off. It didn't make the list because people just hate land destruction in general, but if you do play with land destruction, you should definitely give Impending Disaster a shot. I think it's a slightly more polite way of blowing up everyone's lands because they at least have an entire turn cycle to prevent it from happening. Alright, on to the list. Number 10 is Citadel of Pain. 2 and a red for another enchantment that says at the end of each player's turn, Citadel of Pain deals X damage to that player, where X is the number of untapped lands he or she controls. So for anyone who has more control going on in their meta, or who is worried about their spells being countered, this is the card for you. Simply put, if your opponents want to leave up mana for counter spells or instant speed shenanigans, they will have to take damage for it. So either they are going to tap all of their lands at the end of their turn, or they are going to take the damage. And at that point, you know they are leaving mana open for something specific. So even if this doesn't stop your opponent's plans, it will at least give you a heads up for when you can expect to play around counter spells and instant speed shenanigans. Number 9 is Archetype of Aggression, a 3/2 enchantment creature human warrior that says creatures you control have trample, and creatures your opponents control lose trample and can't have or gain trample. Geez, this is like the 4th, 5th enchantment on the list. Anyway, this is on the list because I can't tell you how many games in which trample becomes the deciding factor in who lives or dies. There have been so many times I've seen people play huge creatures like Consuming Aberration just to have them repeatedly chump blocked and end up dealing 0 damage to the opponent. Giving your creatures trample can nullify your opponent's blockers completely, and they will often choose not to block at all and just take the damage to spare their creatures. More important than giving your creatures trample, Archetype of Aggression takes it away from your opponents, and that is something that can keep you alive. Number 8 is Shunt, 1 and 2 red for an instant. Change the target of target spell with a single target. So this is a form of red control, almost like a red counter spell. An opponent tries to destroy your commander with, say, Phythesis, and you respond by changing the target to their commander. You can also change the target of other things like Ancestral Recall or Time Stretch. One of the coolest things you can do with Shunt is that you can counter a counter spell. So say someone is trying to counter your commander. You respond by casting Shunt, changing the target of the counter spell to Shunt itself. Because Shunt goes on the stack last, it resolves first. So by the time counterspell resolves, it no longer has a legal target, and it is effectively countered. There are several red cards like Shunt, so try them out. I'm sure they will please you. Alright, on to number 7, which is Breath of Fury. 2 and 2 red for another enchantment, Aura. When enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice it and attach Breath of Fury to a creature you control. If you do, untap all creatures you control, and after this phase, there is an additional combat phase. So pretty much, if you have enough creatures, this can give you enough combat steps to finish the entire game. And for 4 mana, that's a great deal. Great for token decks and tribal decks, and it works ridiculous with Insurrection. In the right deck, Breath of Fury is just a total bomb. Just taking as many combat steps, basically, as you have creatures to sacrifice. Number 6 is Burn Away. 4 and a red for an instant. Burn Away deals 6 damage to target creature. When that creature dies this turn, exile all cards from its controller's graveyard. So 6 damage is enough to kill most creatures in the game, which is great. But what makes this card even better is the fact that it exiles the graveyard of that creature's owner. So this can shut down a graveyard deck, and it can also be really useful when dealing with annoying gods that go back to their owner's hand at the end of the turn. So this will kill a Locust God and exile it before your opponent gets it back to their hand. Burn Away can also deal with those Eldrazi that shuffle back into their owner's libraries when they die, such as Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. The trick is that you have to wait and cast it on the opponent's turn. The reason being that whoever turn it is will have their trigger go on the stack first. So if you wait till your opponent's turn, Burn Away will go on the stack second, and it will resolve first, exiling Kozilek before it gets shuffled back into the library. Of course, with Kozilek, you will also have to deal him an additional 6 damage to kill him. So Burn Away is a sweet removal spell, killing a creature and exiling a graveyard. Number 5 is Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs. 3 and 2 red for a 5/4 Ogre Warrior. It says, whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks, if you're the defending player, create a 3/3 red Ogre creature token unless that creature's controller pays 3. So this ability happens for every creature that's attacking you. So I think I like to think of this card as the red version of Ghostly Prison, and that it just deters your opponents from attacking you. Unlike Ghostly Prison, however, if they don't pay the tax, you get a creature which could potentially block and kill their attacking creature. So in some situations, I think Kazul can actually be more successful in deterring the opponents from attacking. I love playing this card in decks that force your opponents to attack, like Thantis the Warweaver. Such a great card, and one that I see pretty much no one playing. Number 4 is Molten Psyche. 1 and 2 red for a sorcery. Each player shuffles the cards from his or her hand into his or her library, and then draws that many cards. And if you control 3 or more artifacts, Molten Psyche deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of cards that player has drawn this turn. So this is one of the more loot versions of Wheel of Fortune, because instead of drawing 7, you just draw as many as you previously had. But what I like about Molten Psyche is that you shuffle your hand back into your library instead of discarding it. There are lots of times when you don't want something in your hand or your graveyard, you want it in your library, so you can pull some shenanigans and somehow cast it for free with something like Golos Tireless Pilgrim. And of course, the other upside of Molten Psyche is that if you have Metalcraft, this can deal your opponents a ton of damage. You can get even more value out of it if you can find a way to cast spells at instant speed. So you wait until your opponent draws a bunch of cards on their own turn, and then cast Molten Psyche at instant speed to deal them an absurd amount of damage for just 3 mana. Next is Urabrask the Hidden, 3 and 2 red for a 4/4 Praetor that says creatures you control have haste, and creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. So this is the most underrated and underplayed Praetor of them all, which is why it's my favorite. Other Praetors are just so overpowered that your opponents will freak out as soon as you cast them, and will usually team up to take them out as quickly as possible. Once you cast Urabrask, however, an opponent will literally pick up the card and say something like, "Nice, not as good as the other Praetors though," which is hilarious to me because Urabrask is actually really good. For one, I think haste is one of the best abilities in the game, because it lets you make sure you're getting value out of your creatures right away. Without haste, your creature will usually have to wait until the end of the turn cycle before they are of any use to you. With haste, you can be confident that your creature will at least get 1 attack in before your opponents destroy it. Just as important as giving your creatures haste, Urabrask takes it away from your opponents and then some. Not only does he nullify your opponent's haste abilities, he also makes it so their creatures can't block right away. And anyone who has played with Blind Obedience knows that this can definitely turn the tide of the game in your favor. So I think Urabrask is a fabulous card, game-ending even, and it's extremely underrated. Number 2 is Vicious Shadows. 6 and a red for an enchantment. It says whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, you may have Vicious Shadows deal damage to target player equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. This card is just stupid. It is so good. Just imagine you control Vicious Shadows, one of your opponents has 3 cards in hand, and there are 10 creatures on the battlefield. If someone board wipes, you can deal 30 damage to the player with 3 cards in their hand. And it gets even better when you put it in a deck with a sacrifice theme like Korvald or Prosh. You just keep sacrificing creatures like Bloodghast and getting them back again and sacrificing them again to deal your opponents a ridiculous amount of damage with Vicious Shadows. Even if you don't have a sacrifice theme, I think this card is great and can do great things in any red deck, especially in this multiplayer format that we play where everyone's casting lots of creatures and everyone's playing plenty of board wipes. And now for my number 1 underrated red card for Commander, it's Final Fortune. Final Fortune is 2 red for an instant that says take an extra turn after this one, you lose the game at the end of that turn. So just think of how many games you've played where you've said to yourself, I was just 1 turn away from winning. That's what this card is all about, making that turn happen. Obviously it's risky, but man, 2 mana for an extra turn is totally worth the risk. Sometimes you are just about to win, but your creatures are summoning sick, or maybe you just don't have enough mana to pull off the win in a single turn. Final Fortune is just the answer you're looking for. You can also pair this with things like Platinum Angel to make sure you don't lose. Final Fortune goes especially well in combo decks, giving you the extra mana you need and an extra combat step to pull off the combo. Great card, and one I have never seen anyone play except for me, and I'll tell you, it works. It's an extra turn spell for just 2 mana with a downside that is negligible as long as you can win the game on that extra turn. And that's it. Those are my top 10 underrated red cards for Commander. So let me know what you think. Does your playgroup use these cards? What are some cool tricks that we can pull off with these cards? And of course, tell me, what are some of your favorite underrated red cards? Well, that's all, folks. Thanks for listening. This is Eric from Bane Alley Magic signing off. Until next time, take care, take it easy.